And that's one of the reasons why for IF types, you usually have to kind of like remind them that they can get to the other side and that they've been sitting with this for a long time and they can get kind of victim-y around it and kind of go like, I don't know how to overcome. For the ET types, you have to first show them there's a problem and then you have to get them through all of that stuff. And so which one's better? Right?
Yeah.
It kind of depends.
So if the logic follows, are the EFs causing all the trauma?
Yeah, they're the ones who are totally the ones that are causing all the trauma for everybody else.
Hi, welcome back to the Personality Hacker Podcast. My name is Joe Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
So mental health, Antonia.
Yep.
Personality types and mental health.
Yep.
People have been asking us for the past 40 to 50 years.
Yeah, it has been at least 50 years.
I think since like 1952.
Yep.
Even before we started this podcast, they've been asking us, can you please talk about personality types and mental health?
1952 wouldn't be 50 years ago.
Whatever. That's like 70 some years, over 70 years ago.
That was a long time ago.
Whatever.
Well, whatever
50,
since
60,
people
70.
have been asking us to record a podcast on personality and mental health since 1952.
Since the beginning of time. Let's just say that. So
Feels like that.
We've been reticent for this. I mean, we've dabbled in it here and there. I think we talked about ADHD or something at one point, or
which I'm going to just go on the record right now to say is one of our worst podcasts.
Really?
Uh-huh.
It was mostly stats and like we were looking at some reference materials because we were like, we can't just riff on this. We have to know what we're talking about.
Yeah, but the information was a little aged because we were using Milo, which stands for Mary Isabel, it was Mary Isabel Library Online.
Yeah.
And it's basically the encyclopedia or like the compendium of all of the research done on Myers-Briggs for the last since like the 60s or 70s or whatever.
Academic journals, papers, things like this. So Dr. Dario Nardi always says this at our events. He's always like, people come up to me all the time and say, has there ever been a study done on twins and personality types? And he always, at the conferences and events and things, goes, absolutely yes. It's the Minnesota twin study. It's been done. It's on Milo. It's on the database. You can read it for yourself. And I think that's important that there's been a lot of work, and we've referenced this in the past. There's been tons of academic papers, research projects. Like, this isn't just a brand new subject matter of personality types. Like, people have talked about this stuff.
The challenge is that back then they didn't do a lot of cognitive function research. They did mostly dichotomy level research.
Why do you say back then? It's not being updated currently?
I mean, it probably is actually. I'm not sure. I haven't looked for the most recent research on Milo.
I didn't mean to put you on the spot. Like, tell me, has it been updated recently, Antonia?
Well, what I'm saying is that there was a stretch of time there where most type research that was done was missing the component of Jungian cognitive functions.
Fair enough.
It was mostly based on 16 types or dichotomies. And so like the ADHD or ADD, I think they were still using ADD, and I think it's now officially ADHD, encompasses all of it.
Yeah.
But at the time, they were still using dichotomy level information for the research. And you and I are so cognitive function oriented that I'm trying to make connections. Like I would just say that it wasn't our research. It's not our information. And we were basically doing it because people just kept asking.
Yeah.
And so I don't think it was a very good episode. And I also think that
I stand behind it.
Well, I think basically to me, it's kind of a common sense piece.
Yeah.
Which is, at the time, there was burgeoning research about children and ADHD that wasn't really taking into account the fact that I don't think children are designed to sit at a desk for 6 hours a day. And
what?
Yeah, right. And
who would have known?
And pay attention to the teacher and do things by rote.
But that's what school's supposed to teach you, is to sit there still and be a little obedient citizen. That's the whole point of school, isn't it?
Yeah, and I'm not totally convinced that there isn't a lot of this isn't just the fact that we raise children in that environment and we're going to get, somewhat predictable results.
Yeah.
So I'm not saying it's not a thing. I'm just saying that how much of a node in the system is that? So that wasn't really taken into consideration, et cetera, et cetera. So I don't think it's that great of an episode.
Fair enough. What's the Krishnamurti quote? I can't remember the exact quote. What does he say?
It's no measure of health to be well adjusted to a profoundly sick society.
Yeah. So that immediately makes me think that if society has a standard, let's say the standard is for a child to sit in a classroom, you said 6 hours. I know some kids that are in there 8, 10, longer hours because their parents are working. They have to do before and after school programs. They're in school a long time, sometimes in the evening with sports. They're there all day, right? So that's the standard. And if you don't fit into that standard, well, you have a disorder. You're bad and wrong. You have a mental problem. You have emotional problems. You don't fit our standard. So there's something wrong with you. Well, what about the standard itself? We never evaluate that, first of all.
Yeah.
I think that's the thing I would first ask is, well, is this a natural environment to only be with your peers? And every 45 minutes, when a bell rings, you stand up like cattle and you move to another location in the same building and you sit down with your peers again in a new configuration. And you do that for hours on end. Like, there's no like telephones in the situation. There's no like, usually no computers. I think it's changing now, but like the real world you're going to enter, none of those things are there. You're with only your peer group. It's a synthetic environment. And then we go, and these kids are not doing well in this environment. What's wrong with these kids? It's like, to me, it's the stupidest thing adults do to children. It's like we put them in synthetic environments and expect them not to have disorders.
Yeah, I think there's much to criticize. There's much to reevaluate. And I think most people don't think that the school system is like set up exactly the way it's supposed to be.
The reason I bring that up is not to crap on the school system, although I love the opportunity. The reason I bring that up is because when we talk about mental health and when we talk about, normative things or non-normative things, well, what is normal? What is the thing that is expected? That is part of the equation that we often don't initially set the framework. We just buy the assumption and then we go from there. So when we talk about mental health, in relation to what is my first question?
Yeah, well, so we're going to talk about mental health, personality type and mental health, in part because since 1952, people have been asking us to do so. So we're going to finally get around to it.
No, we just started the podcast in 2014. So
that's the joke, Joel. You don't have to explain
But
it.
somebody doesn't know that. They're like, well, how long have you guys been doing this? How old are you? We look young for our age.
I look very young for my age.
We're both like
We've
older
been
than
doing
boomers.
the podcast since the 50s. So since podcasting was a thing in the 50s, right? So we've been doing it since
absolutely.
then. So
new media.
That's so we're doing it because of a lot of requests for it, and I mentioned I didn't particularly love the podcast on personality types and ADHD, and because when we do an episode like this because of overwhelming requests for a long time, it's usually a dubious result in my mind.
It brings people together.
Yeah.
Right? It brings everybody together and there's no discord or disagreements.
And their hatred of the episode, probably.
Yeah, it's just amazing.
So it usually has dubious results. And I have avoided this subject for a super long time, in part because I was like, well, I'm not really a person who's that into mental health disorders. I'm really not. I'm just not that interested in basically the kind of psychology that studies how things can go very wrong.
Yeah.
Or how things go wrong. I'm way more interested in positive psychology and in how things can go right and how we take ourselves from a baseline and heal things that can be healed and that sort of thing. The whole realm of real like truly painful psychological disorders and psychiatric disorders and real like how things can really go in a negative like in a even saying negative, somebody's going to give me pushback. That's another reason is that you start entering this territory and it's a very sensitive territory filled with landmines, and it's just not my cup of tea usually.
Language police of exactly how you say something is extremely important.
Right. There's lots of things like trigger warnings, a lot of things like you don't say negative, say whatever the word I'm supposed to be saying is. So there's a lot of that. Also
why you're probably not interested in this world. Or the interest, there's just like so many rules and so many guardrails in it.
Yeah.
It's like, oh my gosh.
And I also suspect that, like you said, a big part of this is how synthetic are our environments. Like what is it? Desmond's book, The Human Zoo?
Yeah.
Like why we have so many.
Desmond Morris.
That's
wrote
right.
The Human Zoo.
There's a lot of things that are so synthetic, it's unsurprising that we feel dysthymic around them. You know, it's kind of like even an animal knows that that's not a real tree. It's a tree painted onto a concrete wall when they're trapped inside of a cage, not a cage necessarily. They usually have little habitats, but if it's painted on the concrete, they know it's not real. Right. It's got to be a real tree. Otherwise, the paint, it doesn't do anything for them.
Yeah.
And it's kind of similar. Like we have a lot of things in our modern world that feel like painted jungles on concrete. And then we wonder why we're sad, dysthymic, like, oh, I've been trapped in an office cubicle 40 hours a week in the winter, I never get to walk outside and get vitamin D because my commute is done in the dark and I leave when it's dark and I've been in this cubicle for 40 hours a week. Why am I so down and depressed in January? It's
Yeah.
like, well, because vitamin D is absolutely vital for your mental well-being. So it's just stuff like that. So I think a part of this mental health conversation too has to do with how we take care of our bodies,
Yeah.
whether or not we're doing basic things, to ensure we are, that we're doing everything we can to replicate the conditions that our ancestors were in when they did not have these same
Yeah.
disorders. So I'm a little hesitant.
So let me just ask this question. Let me just cut through all this clutter. In your opinion, and I'm teeing you up and we can have a conversation about this. In your opinion, do you think we can correlate or connect mental health issues directly to personality types? Like,
So
what's your opinion on this, or what's your thought on this?
I'm going to give you the long version.
Oh, here we go.
Okay. There's a short version, and I'll figure out what it is after I say the long version. So, whenever I've heard people request this, and they usually don't give a lot of context, they just say, "I want a podcast on personality types and mental health or mental disorders." I always assumed that was the ask. Can you do a direct correlation between certain personality types and certain mental disorders? I always assumed that was the question. And now I'm wondering if the question isn't more, can you talk about the topic? And certainly we can talk about the topic and we
Yeah.
can study it and different components that come into it. But no, I don't believe there's a one-to-one correlation between specific personality types and specific mental disorders.
Really? I would figure that all ENFPs have savant disorder.
Yeah.
Right? Intelligent savant disorder, something like this.
Right.
That would be my expectation.
Yeah, they'd all be like
Genius disorder or something.
That's right. Just absolutely tortured geniuses.
I figured it was a one-to-one map.
There is a one-to-one on ENFPs and being a tortured genius. But other than that, I don't think that there's any other correlations. So I don't think there is.
What about trends or tendencies?
I'll just say this. And I think that's like probably the next question. I think there is, as long as you add modifiers. Now, to set the stage here, there is not a lot of research done around type and mental disorders for a couple different reasons. The first one is that, as a general rule, the psychological community is not a big fan of Myers-Briggs, as a general rule. Now, I know there's rogue therapists out there and counselors.
Listening right now.
I know they're listening right now because I've had a lot of people in our courses tell us that they got put onto Personality Hacker because their therapist recommended the podcast.
I'd say 30% of our PLP course, our Personal Life Path Mentorship, anecdotally, I can't prove this, but 20-30% of people say, yeah, I heard this from my therapist or my counselor.
That might be high numbers, but it
feels like that to me.
It feels
That's
like
what I'm
it's
saying.
a lot.
Anecdotally, it feels like 20-30% of people report, like 1 in 3 people report roughly.
My guess is it's actually more like 10%. That's my guess because
Fair
I've been
enough.
kind of tracking it a little bit.
You're better with numbers than I am.
It feels like a lot. And so that means either there's one very, very busy therapist out there who's who's super into us and sending all these people over, or there's quite a few therapists and counselors that listen to the podcast. And if you're one of those people, then kudos to you. Thank you very much for sticking around, because I know that the psychological community, as a general rule, like as a field and an industry, doesn't really like Myers-Briggs, because Myers-Briggs isn't quote unquote hard science. And I find it interesting that the field wants things as objective as possible because you're studying the mind. And certainly there needs to be some cross-disciplinary components in here that are harder science. Like, we need to study the brain, right? Which is pretty hard science. The brain is like just this organic machine of test different neurotransmitters and chemicals and all that stuff. And so there needs to be a hard science component in there. There needs to be things that are verifiable and repeatable and control-based and that sort of thing. But when you're talking about the mind itself is its own thing. And there's not a lot of hard science that you can put around the mind. But I think there was a time when psychology really didn't want to be just a branch of philosophy. They wanted to separate themselves from philosophy and end up more associated with science. And so I think the trend, or sort of the fad, became, not fad, but maybe the unspoken cultural, sort of wink, wink, nudge, nudge became, we're going to get away from anything that isn't harder science, if at all possible. And so then they started adopting things like Big Five, right, which is a little bit more to their taste. And I think in our podcast on personality types versus personality traits, we kind of talk a little bit about this. But that just basically means that there's not a lot of support in that community, that industry, in that field to weave in, studies of disorders and mental health issues, specifically with Myers-Briggs personality types. And I don't think they do it with Enneagram either, or any of the other systems that aren't the Big Five. So we don't have a lot of information. That's the number one thing. I think the second thing is that when there have been studies done, usually the people who are doing these studies are relying on their subjects to self-report their type, or they'll put them through like the MBTI, which is the Myers-Briggs type indicator. The challenge is that while the Myers-Briggs type indicator is the gold standard and still remains the gold standard, it has a 20% error rate. Now, that 20% error rate isn't like completely off. Usually they have 3 out of the 4 dichotomies accurate. And so if you consider what they're testing for or assessing for, that's actually pretty darn good statistics. Like most of the time, 80% of the time, you're going to get 4 of the dichotomies, right? 4 out of 4 right. And 20% of the time, you're going to get anywhere around, most of the time, 3 out of 4. So that's pretty good.
Yeah.
But it's still not totally accurate. And so unfortunately, that means that self-reported types come in. And my observation has been that most people, first of all, who think they know their type have not taken the MBTI. They have not done the gold standard, number one. And number two, I'd say probably about 25% of people at least are mistyped, if not 33%, 1 out of 3. So that's another challenge, is you've got some mistypes in there that you're navigating around. And then I think finally the big challenge, and this is I think what will launch us into this conversation, is that Myers-Briggs is not a diagnostic tool for mental health. Like that's not his job.
Yeah.
It's assessing cognition, which is pretty, it's kind of like the operating system of the mind. And what apps get loaded onto the operating system are very unique from person to person.
Yes.
So that's just, it's not its purpose. That said, and this is why I think this is the nice road to go down in this conversation, is I do believe it's a node in the system of diagnostics.
Yeah.
And my suspicion is that when there's a disproportionately high number of certain personality types that experience the same style of mental health disorder, like depression or anxiety, or, like things like that.
Yeah.
My suspicion is it's a response of the personality type to society. So there have traditionally been higher numbers of people who have introverted preferences and intuitive preferences that have reported depression and anxiety.
Yeah.
My suspicion, particularly INFs, INFJs and INFPs. Now that could be that you just have a higher number of INFJs and INFPs into type. And so they're reporting more. But my suspicion is that at least in the last century, it was a very extroverted sensing and thinking time period. It was a very, I would say, even in generational terms, the last saculum was kind of felt like a very ESTJ, sort of span of 80 years. So if ESTJ preferences, and I don't think that anymore, by the way, I don't think we're in an ESTJ time period at all. In fact, I feel bad for ESTJs right now that they just missed that time period where they were ideal. And now they're like, I feel like I'm in a very intuitive time period. I'm like, yes, you are. But for that time period in the past that was predominantly ESTJ, or at least the culture was, well, who's going to suffer the most?
Yeah.
People who have the opposite preferences.
Yeah.
So I actually think that the most fruitful conversation around type and mental health isn't the type trying to trace it one-to-one to specific disorders, but rather to understand its value in terms of how it's responding and reacting to the environment.
I'm going to repeat something you told me to make a point to illustrate something else. So hang tight here. I'm just going to say something. You said to me, you were reading the thread at one point. I'm going to get the details of this inaccurately, but it doesn't matter because it's not the point to get it accurate. It's just the general understanding of it. Basically, somebody was struggling with mental health issues, and someone came on and said, okay, but before you address mental health directly, have you taken care of all the other aspects of your life first? Like, are you getting good sleep? Good. Are you eating well? Are you exercising? Are you getting enough sunlight? Like all the basic building blocks.
Drinking enough water,
not drinking alcohol or having too much substance abuse or anything like this. And then ask yourself, do I have a mental health issue? But like, there's a lot of things inside your control first to take care of. So that principle taking over here, I think what I'm hearing you say is, let's say somebody in a classroom is having a hard time sitting still. And we as society, let's say, rush to diagnose them with something like ADHD. And maybe in the understanding here is like, that might be true. They might have ADHD, a clinical diagnosis of ADHD. But we checked first just to see if they're an ESFP personality type, for example, or an EP personality type that's about, testing things in the real world and being up on your feet and kind of engaging with your environment to learn. Like, have we checked that first and just assessed, okay, is this just their style or is this a disorder? And I think that's where type can help us. It's not that every type can correlate directly to a disorder or some mental health issue or whatever, non-normative. I don't know the right words anymore to use. The words I'm supposed to use, please fill those in for yourself so you're not triggered if it's upsetting to you. Whatever that is that I'm supposed to say that's off the normal track. If you're dealing with that, well, is it just a demonstration of your natural personality wiring first? Like the first question, like, is that just how I'm wired? And then to say, oh, I think that's not just how I'm wired. That is something that's a little different than what other people are experiencing or maybe what I could expect for myself mental health wise. Okay, now let me look at this issue. Or, you do it together. You don't just do one before the other, but you definitely factor in, like, am I just a person that's wired this way? I think that's the point I'm trying to make. And I think personal types can help us a lot in that arena.
Well, and to go back to that statement of, have you tried all of the physical things?
Yeah.
Right. And then, and that's all taken care of.
And emotional things too, like meditation or whatever,
I've heard people give major pushback on that because they say, well, if you're depressed, you don't want to do those things. So it's already hard.
Fair enough.
And I would say that is the uphill climb, right? Like you're spiraling down or spiraling up. That's been my observation. And when you're spiraling down, the number one thing you've got to do is you got to stop the trajectory of the spiral.
Yeah.
Like that's the very first thing you do, is to just like disrupt that trajectory down as fast as you can, because the trajectory down will end up in self-sabotage. You won't want to do those things.
It builds its own momentum.
Exactly. And so when you're on your way down, you don't, it's like you just don't have the motivation or incentive to do all of that positive stuff that'll get you turning the spiral back up. And to jump to that as an analogy, if you have certain personality type preferences, it's the same thing. It's harder to do certain actions or activities because you're not pre-wired for that to be in your wheelhouse. And so if there are things you should be doing in order to account for some of these challenges or issues, knowing how you're pre-wired helps explain why some of that stuff is really hard. It's like, if you're not feeling good or if you're feeling really down, go out and contribute. Like go spend time with your community and your friends and go contribute, and that'll make you feel better. That is 100% accurate advice. That is such solid advice. If you're not feeling good, start contributing. But what if you have ITP preferences? An extroverted feeling is your inferior or 3-year-old function, right? Or harmony. Or what if it's like your 8th function? What if you're an ETJ? Now, ETJs might have a little easier time of being able to do this because they have another mechanism of extroverted thinking or effectiveness, right? That can help them kind of navigate that. But if you have ITP preferences, it's a total blind spot. You might not even know where to start.
Yeah.
How do I start to go contribute to other people so I can feel better? Like that just feels massively overwhelming.
Yes.
So, and that's not even a spiral down. That's just like a cognitive question mark, right? It's like, how do people do this? Is there somebody I can call like that can tell me how to start getting involved? And I've noticed that when ITPs crack that code, when they start figuring out how to enter a community and have a tribe and start contributing and finding themselves surrounded by people, it really does create a game-changing experience for them. But based on their preferences, it's going to be a harder lift to get started. It's going to be a bigger ask. Same thing with people with like I and J preferences, going and exercising and getting in their bodies, right? Or, being mindful. Or if you have or EP preferences or ENP preferences in particular, like as ENPs, there are a lot of things that we could be doing to contribute to our mental health that just are about routines.
Yeah.
Just like stick to a healthy routine. And like my brain just goes, you don't know what you're asking. So I think the big correlation between type and mental health is what is the formula of mental health hygiene? And which of those line items are the ones that you in particular struggle with?
Yes.
What has this big barrier of entry? And no matter what type you are, there's going to be something in there that's a struggle for you
Yeah.
to do. Like, yeah, go ahead.
Well, what I hear you saying is it's not necessarily that I will from my personality type know which mental health disorders I have or will have. Again, disorders, whatever I'm supposed
Yeah.
to say again.
Okay.
Mental health issues.
Let's
I'll
just
say.
assume that people aren't going to get
Men-
massively
yeah,
triggered by us always every time using the wrong
Yeah.
word that we're supposed to use. a
Sure.
different word.
Yeah. So mental health issues, whatever those might be. I have mental health issues. It's not that, oh, because I'm this type, I'm going to have these issues.
Right.
What I actually see is it's the reverse. You always say this, Antonia. Healing growth takes more than one tool. I think we got this from Aranio Pius, our friend and colleague teaching over at the Enneagram. It takes more than one tool. And personality types can certainly be a tool in our mental health approach in our lives. As we approach mental health issues for ourselves, whether that's just optimizing our mental health, we don't have any issues that we have to fix or correct for. We just want to get more healthy mentally, which I think is also, you're just optimizing. That's also a part of the mental health conversation. Well, if we're addressing those things, well, one of the tools is type. And it's a way we can look and see what are some of the things that we have more ease to do and what is going to be more challenging for us, and find alternative routes, like different than maybe the general common wisdom would be. Like, just to your point for IPs, go out and contribute. That's a perfect example of an IP, or ITP in particular, saying, well, that's hard for me. Like, that's not intuitive for me. That doesn't come naturally. That's something that's a really heavy lift. So I have to get over a bunch of other things in my personality just to be able to do that thing that might be good for me, but that's really difficult.
Mm-hmm.
And so then it's like, okay, well then if you are that personality type, and that is a recommendation, maybe there's other things you can do now to work on your mental health because we're accommodating for type.
Or that thing is the thing you really just need to figure out how to do, but don't beat yourself up for the fact that it's hard.
Yeah, you might need other tools, other support, other people to help with it.
Right.
And we all have one of these. Like you said, ours is routine, for example. For an ITP, it might be putting yourself out there in a social way if you don't have the skill for that yet. So there's every type. I think every type's going to have certain things in a mental health way that's going to be easier for them to address, and things are going to be more challenging for them to address.
Yep.
And it's just like personal growth in general. Not all personal growth books are written for everybody. You might be reading a book that's like, here's how you get stuff done in your life and organize your life. It's like, this isn't working for me. Why? You're probably a personality type that does not resonate with or work for. And so what personality types can help us do is to know which advice to follow and which to say, okay, I need a workaround for that.
Yep. The other thing is discovering our best fit type can help explain a lot of our past in terms of why we struggled during certain time periods and why other time periods were easier for us.
Yeah.
And I think in particular our childhoods. Now, if you have abusive parents, you have abusive parents. It doesn't matter what your personality type is. I do think that it will impact different personality types differently. Some types are more sensitive and they will pull the whole burden of the context or situation into themselves and process it in real time. And that can be very challenging. As a sensitive child, you will be feeling every inch of it in the moment of abuse. If you are a personality type that is less sensitive, if you're one that has more of that, like sort of, just shut up and bear it and grit and just get to the other side, then what ends up happening is you have it waiting for you when you become an adult.
Mm.
So there are different ways that certain personality types experience trauma. Some of I was particularly good at compartmentalizing and forgetting and ignoring traumatic events from my childhood. I have ENCP preferences. So introverted feeling or authenticity is not a function that I have very good access to. So it's very easy for me to not be clocking my emotions around something and to just like disregard it as important. I don't really hold on to things since introverted sensing or memory is my 3-year-old or inferior function. So I'm not really holding on to much material consciously. And I just kind of I just go to the next thing. I'm endlessly optimistic and I just head to the next thing. That meant that whatever I had not acknowledged as a child was waiting for me as an adult. And until I handled it as an adult, it did show up as mental health issues, right?
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes physical health issues. That's the other thing, is that sometimes certain personality types will also manifest their trauma and their disorders more physically even than emotionally. It's living in all of those realms. But but it might have to come out as a skin condition for you to even recognize there's a problem for some of us. And so I do think that there are certain types. I would say probably the extrovert thinking types. So like the four EET types, ENTJs, ESTJs, ENTPs, and ESTPs. We are the ones who are the best at ignoring trauma and having it revisit us later. And I think the IF types, the four IF types, are the most likely to be feeling it in the moment, right?
Yeah.
INFPs, ISFPs, INFJs, and ISFJs.
And it sticks and holds for a while too.
That's right. Exactly.
Like it's tough to get out of there.
Yeah. And that's one of the reasons why for IF types, you usually have to kind of like remind them that they can get to the other side and that they've been sitting with this for a long time and they can get kind of victim-y around it and kind of go like, I don't know how to overcome. For the ET types, you have to first show them there's a problem and then you have to get them through all of that stuff. And so which one's better? Right? Yeah. It kind of depends.
So if the logic follows, are the EFs causing all the trauma?
Yeah, they're the ones who are totally the ones that are causing all the trauma for everybody else.
Fair enough.
Well, no, I think there's like in the middle there, right?
Of course.
And so obviously EFs are not causing trauma. That said, I mean, some of you are just like there are some IFs out there causing trauma for people, right? And some ETs that are on the receiving end of all the trauma. So that's the challenge of the topic. The challenge of the topic is like you have to understand trauma to begin with and disorders, and then you also have to understand type and how certain types respond to certain situations are going to change from context to context. And then finally, were you odd man out in your environment?
Yeah.
And in what way were you odd man out? So in a family can unknowingly create trauma in a child simply because they do not understand what they're dealing with or working with.
Yeah.
And that can create long-term challenges for a person that feels like disordered behavior.
I recently saw a clip on X. Someone had posted, there was a young woman, I think, that was very upset. I don't remember if it was a video or just a post. This person, I think, had a challenge at their job. I don't know if they had to be moved to a different time or maybe they even lost their job. And they were saying it was very unfortunate. They have a mental health issue with, and I'm like, oh my gosh, this is what I have. They said it was time blindness. Like, I just don't understand the concept of time. And my employer didn't understand that I don't understand the concept of time. And then when I didn't show up for meetings on time, they let me go, or I had a hard time with it. I don't remember what the exact situation was. So I'd like learn a new mental health term, which is time blindness. And I'm like, oh, time blindness. I feel like I'm time blind. It's so hard for me to make deadlines and stay on track and stay, attuned to the clock. It's really hard for me. I have ENFP preferences, and it's like the struggle of my life. Anytime a time clock enters, I get anxious. And like when I took tests in school and there were time tests, I would like, oh no, am I gonna have enough time in this test? Like time was a big issue for me. It's kind of I'd say I have trauma around it in a way. And so I'm like, I have time blindness. And I thought, well, is that true? Or am I just an ENFP? Like, it's just really hard for me to understand my relationship to time because I see it so differently than most other people. I don't have access to the cognition that's very much attuned to the clock and seeing the time and every minute that's going by. My time's more just a general concept in my head. So in some ways I went, well, maybe I had to question myself. Do I have a mental health issue with time like this woman was reporting, or is it just the nature of being my personality type? So I think that's like a personal question we can ask ourselves when we're approaching things like this.
Yeah.
But something like that, when someone has time blindness, they report that I literally cannot figure out how to show up on time for my job, and it's affecting my life, and I'm getting fired, this is hurting me. I guess that's a real world situation for somebody that might be even listening and watching right now. And it would be easy to dismiss them like, well, just learn how to like pay attention to the clock. I think that would be my 10 years ago self would have said, that's time blindness. That's ridiculous. Like, come on, grow up. Because I've never heard it before. I've never heard anyone struggling like that before. But clearly that had to have happened before our modern concepts of mental health, right? So in a situation like that, it's a very tangible situation. It may not be a clinical, I don't know if there's does the DSM have time blindness as like an actual definitive diagnosis of something? Probably it's just a social term. It's probably not a clinical term. It might be. Somebody can let me know in the comments.
I've never heard the concept of time blindness.
Really?
Yeah. I mean, maybe I think you shared that with me, but I didn't. I don't think that I went and I didn't look anything up to see
Yeah.
if it's like a legit thing.
I didn't either. And so that begs the question, like, are there just new mental health terms being invented socially all the time that aren't actual clinical diagnostics
I
or
think
diagnoses?
It's very clear that that is happening.
Okay. So that's something
Yeah.
we have to account for then too.
You too.
People
Like,
are saying, well, this is just a, you know, when a kid, they said he had infant savant syndrome
yeah.
when he was growing up. And
Yeah.
like infant savant syndrome.
I think
is
that's a real thing. I don't think that guy had it, but I think that is a real thing.
Yeah, so I didn't know if he was making that term. Like
Yeah.
these terms people say, I'm like, it sounds legit to me.
Or maybe
Okay,
it
I'm not gonna argue with somebody's definition of something. I'm just gonna take him at face value and say, okay, that person's struggling with time blindness in their life, or are they an EP person? Like when I saw this woman, I thought, well, maybe she just does have EP preferences of some sort.
So time blindness, I think, would be like like if you honestly truly cannot understand the abstraction of time,
Yeah,
you're probably also struggling with the abstraction of money. And you're probably also like struggling with the abstraction of a lot of things that would fall.
abstraction is your disorder,
Abstraction.
your challenge.
Mhm. Yeah, it's abstraction that's the challenge.
Yeah,
And so the inability to understand an abstraction like time might be a legit challenge, and that would mess your life up.
of course.
If you do not have the capacity to tune into the abstraction of a concept like time, it would be something where I'm like, that person is disabled. That's a disability. And so yeah, it would be very difficult to hold down a job or do any like honestly, I don't know how that would not interrupt everything in your life.
Yeah,
So if it's a real thing, it's a real thing. If it's what you're talking about, which is having EP preferences, I would actually say you have more like time anxiety, right? Like you understand the concept of time, it just creates an anxiety in you. And if you have time anxiety, it does go back to having extroverted thinking or effectiveness as your 10-year-old or tertiary function.
you're talking about me personally,
You
specifically me with time anxiety. I would agree to that.
You specifically as somebody who has not just ENFP preferences, but are you yourself?
Yeah,
Like as in, it will be associated with one node in the system will be that extroverted thinking or effectiveness, which is how you, with your personality type, are going to most likely tune into time. Is your 10-year-old or tertiary function. It's associated with an eternal child energy, which means that it's going to seek approval. It means that if you don't get something in the allotted time, it's going to feel particularly weighty, like you're going to lose approval, lose respect from other people. It's also associated with how you grew up. You grew up in a very SP environment that was constantly in motion. Go, go, go. Your parents ran a camp, a teen camp, where everything had to be like, go, 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 and get it out now.
yeah.
You as the only NP type anywhere around ended up not being like none of your preferences were taken into consideration when it came to time. And so, yeah, for you as yourself, like as your bespoke self with ENFP preferences and all the nodes in the system, it totally makes sense that you have time anxiety. But it's not just your type that said that. It was all the other things taken into consideration as well.
Of course.
And so I think when we talk about personality type and mental health, we have to take all the nodes in the system into account,
That's right.
which is why it is a difficult topic to talk about. It's not that you're not depressed because you have INFJ preferences. You may be depressed because you have INFJ preferences and extroverted sensing or sensation is your 3-year-old or inferior function, which means that you are neglecting and ignoring all of your basic biological needs.
Yeah.
That could be it. And it could just be sleep, vitamin D, exercise, water, you're good. Or it could be you have INFJ preferences and you were raised in an abusive household and you slurped absolutely every square inch of that up into you. And now you have all this stuff to process. And and until you process it, you're going to have depression. Or it could be that you have INFJ preferences and you have a job that is on a day-to-day basis forcing you to be around a bunch of people who have a bunch of toxic energy and you're just slurping that stuff inside of you and you're not processing that. And so now you're depressed. Or, right, like it's like, or you could be in a context or situation that forces you to show up outside of your preferences and you don't have any outlet for your introverted intuition or perspectives and it's making you very depressed. It's like basically type and mental disorders is like you start with a type first and then you've got to connect it to why it makes sense. It's almost like an algebra equation. You've got depression as the equals, right? It equals depression. And one of the modifiers is that you have your type preferences. Let's just say ENFJ or INFJ right now. Now you've got to fill in the other integers to figure out why the equation makes sense with this as the result.
Yeah.
Or in systems thinking language, you look at that as one node in the system, but you have to see all the other nodes in the system to figure out why depression is the emergent. So you start with the type, and it gives you a ton of great information. It really honestly does. It tells you how you're naturally wired and what your preferences are for, like, what is an ideal life for somebody like me, right? What are the
Yeah.
contexts and situations that would have been perfect for somebody like me? Now, how did it go off the rails?
Yeah.
Right? What were all the things that were off of that preferential stack? Now, in some ways, it's not bad for life to push against our preferences. Otherwise, we become one-sided. If life and the universe rolls out a red carpet for our personality type, on the other side, we have one-sidedness. We
Yeah.
never have the push-pull of, like sharpening the saw. But we can't have too much of a burden, because that creates, it's too much weight. It breaks us, right?
Yeah.
It creates a tension or a what's the word? There's a level of disappointment. There's
Yeah.
a level of it being too much. Growth happens when we're just a little outside of our comfort zone, but not too much. So you take your type preferences. What's the ideal? And then how much of not ideal would have been just right to make sure that you're a complete person on the other side? And if your circumstances in the past or now are overburdening that, right? It's too much pressure for that system. That's oftentimes when disordered behavior starts to pop up as coping mechanisms.
Yeah. So something came up for me is you talked about that equation where you put the result is, let's say, we're just doing this as a placeholder,
Right.
but like depression.
Right.
And then you said algebraically, in a way, what are all the integers that equal that in whatever configuration they are? And then you said it's kind of like a systems map of your life. And we talk a lot about systems thinking for applying it to the self. We don't really believe as much in cause and effect. We believe in there's a bunch of systems running in your life that create the emergent that is you and your experiences. And so I just realized, I thought about this as you were saying that, and I had this struck me. This is a very tenuous thought, so this might be a wildly incorrect pattern to make. But I immediately went, wait a minute. I bet most people, when they say I have a mental health issue of fill in the blank,
Anxiety,
depression or
Right.
anxiety,
Yeah.
that's not the result of a system running. It's more in the system itself. In other words, I didn't really think about this either as much. It's like what I'm experiencing is not a result of a bunch of systems running that are getting me that result. It's almost like just a foregone conclusion. I just have that result. There's nothing I can do for it. There's no way it's just part of who I am. I have this mental health challenge, and it is one of the nodes in the system that emerges me, not an emergent in and of itself. Makes sense what I'm saying?
Yep.
And I wonder if just working with that alone could give us, as people, more ability to approach mental health in a more sophisticated way. If we just see our mental health issue, whatever that is, as an emergent of a system running. And I think this goes all the way back to that guy who was giving the advice of, well, are you getting sleep? Are you getting food? Are you taking care of your body? Are you getting exercise? You're out in the sun. You take care of all those things, and then let's address the mental health situation. What that person's basically saying is change the system first, tweak things in the system, and see if the emergent stops being anxiety, depression, fill in the blank, whatever it might be, or whatever, ADHD, whatever. Just do those things first, because then okay, these are not the nodes to adjust. These do not influence the result. The result's still happening outside of these nodes that are inside of my control.
Mm-hmm.
Now I'm on the hunt for what node is the factor that's creating this as the emergent. So systems thinking in our mental health is probably the best thing we could be doing. And one of those nodes is our personality type.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And you can see that people tend to over focus on a single node.
Yeah.
They'll do it with like diet. And by the way, there's tons of nutritionists and dietitians who have helped people with some pretty severe depression or anxiety or whatever, because they're actually eating something their body should not be consuming for whatever reason. Their body can't process that, or it's like causing a bunch of, it's like
intolerance or something.
There's an intolerance or an allergy that's creating a bunch of like, the wrong neurotransmitters are going off at the wrong time or whatever. And so that's a big node in the system is, what are you eating and consuming? And so
you are what you eat.
Yeah. And so there are these nodes in the system running. That's like, take each one of them and determine whether or not, like, well, is that the influential node that is creating that output?
Yeah.
Now, when you get into systems thinking, you get to a place where every emergent, so like the result in this case, we're talking about a mental health issue like, like anxiety. That is a node. Every emergent is a node in other systems. And we tend to see that. We tend to see how something like depression or anxiety is a node in other systems with their own emergence.
That's right.
Like the emergent of, I really struggle to go to work every day, right? And we know that anxiety is one of the nodes in that system, or depression might be one of the nodes in the system.
Or socially meet people because I'm anxious to put myself out there or,
Right.
say hi to somebody. I have social anxiety.
Exactly.
It's affecting me in a real way.
Exactly. So we see how it's a node in other systems. But the principle of systems thinking that has been the most helpful for me is that every node in some other system is its own emergent of a whole other system running. So if you've got social anxiety, it's not just a node in another system that's causing like shyness or loneliness or whatever as the emergent. It has its own system creating that as an emergent. So you have to go like one layer down, one layer back.
Thank you.
Right.
This is basically what I was trying to say, and you did it so much more elegantly than I did.
Well, maybe. I'm also using like technical terms, so I hope that it's understandable. But effectively, yeah. So is type a node in the system? Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
I would say type is definitely a node in the system.
And it is a result of a whole other system running.
That's right.
For example, your cognitive functions,
Mm-hmm.
how they're in a particular order, what we call a cognitive function stack, or here personality, we call it the car model.
Mm-hmm.
That's a system running of different cognition firing off in your brain, your mind,
Mm-hmm.
creating the emergent that is your personality type, the one you identify with.
Exactly.
And then that lends itself to mental health stuff.
That's
and
right.
other aspects of your life.
Well, and another principle of systems thinking that I think is so powerful is that every node in a system has a relationship with all the other nodes. And so it's not just your personality type, it's your personality type in relationship to the environment. It's your personality type in relationship to the environment in which you grew up in. It's your personality type in relationship to things like motivation, right? And like I mentioned, it doesn't matter what type you are, there is something on the list of like the top 20 things you have to do to have good mental health, right? Like all of these things. Your personality type will resist at least one of those lists or things on the list. You're going to be actively resistant to it. And that one thing that you're actively resistant to might be the thing that is the game changer, which is why if you go all the way back to Jungian analysis, because Jung used the skeleton, the basic, the bare bones, the substrate of what we use as type now, those cognitive functions and an understanding of how self is made.
Yeah.
He used that not as an interesting business application or theory. He used it to do clinical analysis on people who were in really bad mental health situations. Like it was disordered behavior that started this whole thing off. But you can't just do a one-to-one correlation. In his mind, you had to analyze the person. You had to understand who they are before you could start diagnosing willy-nilly. Oh, you've got this cognitive function, you're this psychological type, so you do this thing.
Yeah.
The only thing that was always part of the medicine, so it was always part of the prescription, was the need to integrate disowned parts, to integrate the other side of what we would call in the car model, the driver function, that 3-year-old. Integration of our inferior or 3-year-old function is always part of the prescription. So type can help us understand that. What are the parts of ourselves that we're pushing away that we need to integrate and make part, like to make a whole self?
Yeah. In our personality life path mentorship, we actually take 1 week, we do 8 weeks, and we take 1 week for each of the 8 cognitive functions. And at the end, it's at the end of the weekly call, the live call, we give the students that are in that program the assignment to go do an exercise or multiple exercises to find out their relationship in their real life to that cognitive function's energy and how it represents itself. Regardless if that cognitive function is dominant in their personality or not, we all engage with these areas of life. And at the end of the call, I always say to people, I say, pay attention to obfuscation, confusion, or resistances to your relationship with the energies that this cognitive function represents. There's something informational. Like you can find a lot of information about yourself there and what's going on for you. And to your point, Antonia, I think that we tend to do that. We tend to resist certain things that will give us our health because it might have some skill development to have to do. We might have to give ourselves some permission. We might create insight to know what to do. Maybe we just motivate ourselves to take the actions. I don't know exactly, or we just don't have the resource right now. We're not resourced for it potentially. But often there's a reason we're not attending to one of those things. So I can almost imagine somebody watching, listening right now going, okay, so I guess I've got my personality type I'm starting with, my my cognition, my 4 letters. And then if I understand my car model, which is one layer deeper. And if you want to really understand this, go over and get an owner's manual for your personality type over at our website, because that'll take you deeper into the cognitive functions, talking about that car model, how you learn information, make decisions. If you understand that, now you start to take that and you go, okay, what on that list of mental health things that are healthy for me, what am I resisting? And does it correlate to my personality type? And is there some skill or some permission or some insight I can create, or fill in the blank, to be able to start to address that? Start putting the systems map of my life together. That's what we do in PLP, right? We come out of that whole program with a systems map of the life to know which nodes are influenceable, which ones you can't do anything about. They just are, and you have to just accept them, which that's a role. That's work too, just accepting what you can't change. And then which ones are going to be the most important to work on right now? Like they're going to make the biggest shift for you in your personal life. So you can kind of start to map this out for yourself. If you're listening, you don't have to join a personality life path, although you should. You absolutely should. It's fantastic. It'll change your life. But you could start with just some paper and some journals, kind of piecing this together. If you struggle with mental health issues, I think that you can at least diagnose some of the avenues of movement, of change, of opportunity for yourself. And one of those might be getting clinical help. I mean, it might be getting real therapy, maybe medicine. I don't know. Everybody's different. But it's nice to have personality types as a place that can give us more fidelity into what's going on for us, right? It dives below the cognition of the mind and really shows us how we are processing things as an individual.
Yeah. And I think the other... that I would totally agree with that. I think one of the other challenges just generally in talking about mental health is that is a huge, huge, huge subject.
Yeah.
I probably should have mentioned this from the very beginning, all the way from like basic mild neurosis or coping mechanisms, all the way up to like things that cause hallucinations so that you can't engage and interact with the reality around you. Right. Yeah. And so most people, when they're talking about mental health, are not talking about like schizophrenia or something that is that clearly needs like a heightened level of attentiveness and medication,
clinical help,
and real clinical help. Exactly.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. And so so the mental health is a huge, huge, huge subject. And when we talk about some of the ones that you might call a neurosis, Jung's opinion is that all like neurosis was basically the unconscious struggling with disowned parts. It's like the mind, the conscious and the unconscious mind at war with each other, or why neurosis or neuroses happen.
Yeah.
And so type can definitely help diagnose what are our disowned parts. Like there isn't a predictable neurosis that will come from disowned parts, but that neuroses come from disowned parts is predictable. Does it make sense? It's like, it's not like, okay, so if you disown this part of you, this is the neurosis, or at least if there is, I'm unaware of it. There might be a beautiful, gorgeous, huge maps in place of that. I'm unaware of it. I just know that when we have parts of ourselves that we were rejecting,
yes, that
comes out as weird. Like we have weirdnesses, like things that are not serving us.
Yeah, I mean, one way I just imagine this immediately is, let's say every one of your issues, the things you don't want to have to confront. Let's just use the analogy of you being in a swimming pool and you're, 5 or 6 foot depth. So you're, about neck height. So you're not underwater, but you're in the swimming pool. And every one of those issues I throw you as a beach ball filled with air, and you grab it and you don't want it to be out in the open. So you push it down onto the surface and you hold it under your body. Maybe you put it between your legs, and I throw you another one. You start to do that too. But now you've got like 5 or 6 I've thrown at you, and you're trying to hold them all into the water. Above the surface, you're going to look pretty weird because you're going to like be in a crouched position. You're not going to be moving very much. You're going to be trying to hold all of this together and hold it under the water. And it gets harder and harder the more you add to it. And all of these things want to come to the surface, but you have to contort yourself to be able to contain them from blasting through using the air to the surface of the water. Just imagine how silly somebody would look trying to do that on a long enough timeline.
Or uncomfortable.
And then eventually it's unsustainable. Eventually, if I keep throwing these at you, you're not going to be able to hold all of them under the water. Well, some are going to just come out, and some you didn't intend to come out.
Yeah.
Right? The very first one I threw you, which is the most deepest, darkest one you don't want to contend with, it's starting to get really hard to hold on to because you just have so much volume now. And you just want to show us the one side of you above the surface, but there's all this to contend with. We talked about this in a recent episode about shadow work. And it's like that also can amplify and add to mental health, because like I've actually accelerated the mental health challenges I might have because I'm unwilling to confront, to your point, Antonia, parts of myself that I might have to just get over my own ego or look a little foolish or silly or whatever it might be. And so now I've piled on even more mental health challenges because I'm not willing to address this part of my shadow.
Yeah. Well, and the rougher your upbringing, like
Yes.
the harder it was to contend with all of that stuff, because a lot of times people are carrying their parents' stuff, or
they're carrying all these beach balls for everybody else.
That's
already,
right. Yeah.
They come preloaded with a bunch, and now they get more of their own. It's almost intolerable.
And you get a bunch of messaging that if anybody sees any of those beach balls, it's like a super unsafe situation. And so then
no
you're
one will
just
accept
like,
you, etc.
That's right. And you just like, now you have all the neurosis of like hiding all of these parts from yourself and from other people, and nothing ever feels safe. And like, there's a lot of things that can, stack on it and just exacerbate the problem like crazy.
Yeah.
So, so to go back to the original topic, and recognizing this is probably going to be a very unsatisfying way of addressing all of this, type is, in my opinion, a very helpful tool to understand our mental health. It's very helpful. There's no silver bullets.
Yeah.
There's no one-to-one correlations. The only time we can see these correlations are in patterns of the day. Meaning, like if your family is a very SP family and you're an NP, just like yours was, Joel, you're probably going to have certain things come up, right? Like certain, maybe even neurotic behaviors to accommodate for the fact that nobody acknowledged how you're pre-wired.
Yeah.
Or if you're an INFP or an ISFP in an ESTJ environment or world, that's probably going to create some challenges. I know an ESTJ who was raised in an ISFP world, and that's created a bunch of challenges for him, right? Like he's really struggles to figure out how he's supposed to be showing up in the world, because everything was about emotions. And so it's kind of created some challenges for him. So, there are some predictable patterns based on, say, like maybe culture. Like this is a time period in history where we behave like this. So the people who are not wired to behave like that, they're going to have some challenges. But there's no beautiful, elegant theory that maps these things together.
Yeah.
That said, knowing your type, hugely beneficial. Just as, I guess I started out by saying that. Very beneficial as a help, as an aid in diagnosing some of these challenges, some of these neurosis, some of these mental health issues. And then recognizing what we tend to resist. That might be the thing we need to be doing in order to get our mental health back up to, to the place we want it to be if we're suffering, if we're in a time period of challenge.
So when you say deeply unsatisfying podcast, you mean we're not going to give a one-to-one correlation like all ENFPs deal with this particular mental health issue or have a tendency to, because it's too complex to
really is.
Map that way.
Yeah.
But I actually don't think it's disappointing at all, because it gives the building blocks for actually seeing real world change. You now, like you can, if you're listening or watching right now, you could go, okay, what is the system of my life? What are the nodes running in that system to get the emergence that I'm experiencing? And then every one of those emergence or every one of those nodes that's running also has its own system running as well. Just that thought exercise, going just 2 levels deep and just diagramming or writing out kind of what is going on and all the different aspects that creates this. And that's the emergent I'm getting. That is already deeply empowering, I think. And I like the fact it's system because it means it can be approached by anybody of any type, of any station of life, of any background, because you're not going, oh, I have to match myself to this map. The map emerges from your situation. Like what you're experiencing, that's the map to why you're experiencing it.
Yeah.
And I think it's approachable for everybody. 100% of people can approach it that way.
Okay, fair enough. It makes me think of something Dario Nardi said, our friend Dr. Dario Nardi. He said, type won't do the work for you, but it will tell you what work needs to be done.
Yeah. So it can be very helpful in that.
Super helpful.
Diagnostics. I think that's really what I'm learning is, I think in the early days of Personality Hacker, we thought, oh, we're here to help people solve problems. And we are, like our clients and people come to us for coaching and the Personality Life Path. I mean, people solve their issues and get through things and they make a difference in their life. But I think the diagnostic part of it, diagnosis, is so key to this.
Yeah.
And you can't solve your challenges till you know what your challenges really are.
Yeah.
And personality type helps us get a triangulation on it, helps us understand how we're wired in relationship to mental health challenges or issues or things that are going on for us. It helps us get another aspect or another piece of the puzzle in all of it.
It's why it's such a noble pursuit to really dive down into type, specifically cognitive functions and the order of cognitive functions you prefer.
Yeah.
And really how to define those and really how to understand how they made you, how they helped make you who you are. Not, they don't make you who you are, but they helped craft it. It's kind of like the container that helps forge, like that's part of what, like how we collect our experiences, how we form our thoughts and opinions, how we process our emotions, how we understand the patterns and the meaning of our lives. So I think it really is. I think it's a noble pursuit to dive down into type and really get to know ourselves that way, so that we can do what you're talking about.
Yeah, I think if you're interested in this kind of work, like a systems map of your life, I really want you to check out our Personality Life Path Mentorship. If we're in an enrollment time period, I would strongly consider you look at that program. It goes through 8 weeks. We do it virtually for 8 weeks. And we look at all of the 8 Jungian cognitive functions one at a time. And we have everyone on the same function for the week. So everybody brings their individual type and we show how it relates to your personality, even if it's not part of your personality cognition and your ego syntonic functions, the first 4 in your car model. I think it's really powerful because it looks at your relationship with all of those over 8 weeks. And then we have a 3-day, sometimes a little longer live event at the end of this, depending on the situation that we're in for that season or that exact experience. That can usually be done virtually. We often encourage people to do it in person though, because the learning can be so much more powerful. But it is a program that's designed for you to diagnose what's going on, develop the systems map for your life, and then identify the first nodes that need to be addressed first, like the first things you have access to change, and then making a plan, a life path for those changes that you want to make. And people have been reporting that's life-changing, and I've seen people's lives changed in it. So I would encourage you to really check out this program if it's an enrollment time period and it works out for you. It is powerful. We stand behind it. It is the life's work that myself and Antonia are doing at this time. I mean, I think we'll have other life's work we'll bring up, but right now, this is something that's very important to us at a heart level, at a real gut level change for people. We're seeing people's lives change. And so I'd really encourage you there. If you're not ready for something that in depth, you can get started with a Personality Hacker Owner's Manual for your personality type. It's very approachable. It just walks through all the basic aspects of your cognition, how to build your life around a flow state, staying in flow as much as possible. How do you grow using your personality type? How do you avoid things like looping, which is where your driver and your 10-year-old get in cahoots and they kind of bypass your co-pilot? And then how do you grow your co-pilot so it can be a translator for some of the best parts of you and some of the more challenging parts of you? It's a fantastic program. So if you're not ready for a personality life path, you should head over and get an owner's manual for your type. I think it will actually be the first step for you. And then I want to hear from you. What do you think about some of these topics that we're talking about? Some of the aspects of mental health, personal growth, personality types. What's coming up for you as we approach this from a systems map level? Have you had some mental health challenges in life? And what have those looked like? What have you done to overcome them? Has personality type lent itself to a tool in the system of your life to be able to address those? Or has it fallen down on the job and you weren't able to with type? We'd want to hear the story. What was the experience you had? You can come over, leave a comment, ask a question, or more importantly, directly below this episode at personalityhacker.com, you can share your story of your experience. We'd love to hear about your experience and get a conversation with the community started.
That's right. And if you enjoyed the podcast, you can subscribe to us on tons of different platforms for listening to podcasts. You can watch us on YouTube. We have a video podcast, and you can come join the conversation there. And Joel mentioned you can dive deeper into your personality type and understand all of those layers that help as a diagnostic tool for any neuroses you might be experiencing right now by getting a copy of your personality type owner's manual.
That's right. All right. Well, let's wrap this up for personality types and mental health. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
And we'll talk with you on the next Personality Hacker podcast.